Hi, we continue in Genesis 33 today as we complete the reunion of Jacob and Esau, which ends with a disunion, with them going off their separate ways with no covenant, no meal, and no exit greeting at all. So what's going on in the scene that seemed to start with such promises? Esau came right up to Jacob and ran up and embraced him and kissed him, and yet Jacob has been reticent to embrace his brother and will refuse in this scene to travel onward with him. So to set our context, as we see, we're in this section here, and as I'll see by the end of this video, as we go into the next unit here, although I continue through verse 17 here, I could have gone either way, but I wanted to set that up. Many scholars see this whole section as a later addition, and yet, as so often is the case, I'm going to try to show how it all fits nicely together, and the story would not be complete without this dark postscript to the situation with Jacob and Esau, and also must continue through all of this to the death of Rachel and Isaac as well to complete the story. So we'll see how it does all fit together, despite some scholars' attempts to separate them into sources and parts. As we've been looking at through this whole section of Genesis 32 and 33, the number of both word plays and intratextual references back to the initial blessing scene as we saw last time. But now we're down to this situation here, where the only one that's in our immediate situation is Jacob's lame excuses. We'll see, my Lord knows that children are frail, using the word rakim, the same thing that described Leah's eyes back there. And this next one will be in our next unit. And there's an interesting element of what we see here. If I back out one size, you can see that this first part, 33, 1-7, formed a nice ABA chiasm, as we looked at there. And this part here, from 8 to 11, forms a very nice ABCBA chiasm. And yet this is not chiastic here. Is there a reason for that? Well, I'd like to suggest that these two chiasms express the hope of a positive reunion. At the center of this chiasm is Esau reaching out to call, embrace, fall on his neck, and kiss and weep. And in the center of this one is Jacob's acknowledgement that to see Esau's face is like seeing the face of God. So it seems like that's brought them together. And yet we see here they come apart, each going separately their own ways. And so I'd like to suggest that one possible reason for not having a chiasm here is that the story is now disjointed. After this nice symmetry here, or almost symmetry, that set up a nice reunion where they could have joined together and raised their kids together and had a whole rest of their lives together, now they never see each other again. And so, whereas we look at this, we'll see how Jacob has continued to address his brother as Lord and evidently indicates his lack of trust. And today it's even more explicit than otherwise. His excuses are utterly feeble, and Esau must see through that because there's nothing reasonable about it all, but Esau makes no comment. So let's leave this up and we'll look at our passage, starting in verse 12. And I left verse 11 up here because that was the end of the issues about the present here, except the blessing back. And so Esau has received back, at least symbolically, the blessing as expressed through the 550 animals, using the word barakah there. And so in response to that, after Esau takes it, we hear this. Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I will go alongside you." And as my note here from Westerman below you can see, he says, it can be read as a polite but subtle way of saying, quote, that a reconciliation between brothers need not require that they live side by side. But it also can be read more suspiciously, as I'm doing here, that Jacob is still not quite trusted his brother and offers various lame excuses. I note further down below, while Esau gave in to Jacob's urging on of the present, Jacob refuses to reciprocate and accept Esau's offer to travel together. And we can also read this as we have been reading, not just at the level of the two brothers, but at the level of the two nations who were in Rebekah's womb, all the way back to 25:23. So we can see here, it can express one way Israelites can live, quote, with Edomites in the same land, but not directly together. And we get to chapter 36, where we hear a couple of times Esau as Edom. We'll look more closely at the Edom traditions and what Genesis might be doing with that in relation both the Deuteronomy tradition we looked at in 23:8 as well as the 2 Samuel tradition in 2 Samuel 8. Esau says, let us journey on our way. And the word for journey here, nissa, is the first time it's used in the Jacob cycle. But as we can see from a couple of previous uses, and I'll show those in a minute, it represents not only the nomadic way, but an expression of being on a journey that will keep you on the road, which is to say the nomadic way, but as a way of life, not just to get from one place to another. Let's see back in chapter 11, the Tower of Babel story, they migrated from the east. So migrated there is the term, and came upon the plain, and there they're trying to gather together to build, of course, the city and the tower. Then we saw back in chapter 12, after Abram's initial call, he journeyed on by stages toward the Negev. And we'll see that there's a Shechem component in that, but we'll get to that next time. And then finally, after the separation between Abram and Lot, we see Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. And they separated. So there's certainly a parallel there between the Abram and Lot separation and the Esau and Jacob situation, although this is uncle and nephew rather than two brothers, of course. But Lot's journeying eastward is certainly expressing his direction of his life, back to the old way, and of course we know it will lead him to Sodom. So Esau is suggesting they go together, and yet he says, I will go opposite you, neged here. And we see that a couple of times, not in relation to people. I'd like to note the comparison with how Ishmael's expressed as a relationship with others, although it uses a different word here. We saw, he shall be a wild ass of a man with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin. That's a new RSV. But if you recall, or you haven't watched, you can certainly go back and watch my video on this. This translates it terribly and suggests that Ishmael is somehow an outlaw, rather than that he's independent. That he's living opposite people in the sense he won't be compelled to conform to the way of life around him. And that's perhaps what's at issue here, although there's not enough data from which to draw that conclusion. Perhaps it's simply suggesting that Esau is saying, let's go in parallel. I and my 400. Notice again, there's no reference to his wives or children. We already heard about his Canaanite wives that angered the parents back in the frame that began chapter 27. So we see nothing about them here, but there's the 400, and of course Esau can now see Jacob's women and children. And here's Jacob's response. Before we look at the note here, let's look at the response. So Jacob said to him, my Lord, continuing to address him as that, although Esau has already addressed Jacob as my brother. And in this third person sense, they're not even talking directly. Jacob keeping one step removed. And as I was noting last time, in this question of seeing your face is like seeing the face of God, connecting with Genesis 1:27 and all human beings made in the image of likeness of God, that's only true if we're our true self, which is our vulnerable, honest, just who we are. And plainly, Jacob is not his true self here. Obviously, Esau is not his Lord, he's his brother. And what he says here is plain nonsense. So we may see Esau as his true self, that Jacob can say, seeing you is like seeing the face of God. But can Esau see the face of God in Jacob right now? Certainly not. And that's part of the irony of it, since Jacob is now Israel. Can the Edomites see their God, see the Israelites' God in the face of the Israelites? And isn't that an interesting question? My Lord knows that children are frail, using Rakim, as I noted, for tender or calf in 18:7, but it's Leah's eyes in 29:17, which I noted at the time have been translated various things as weak or tender, and other things like that, suggesting it's not clear what exactly is going on with Leah's eyes. Here it had to do with the tender calf of the meat that's being offered to the visitors. And certainly it may be a recollection of that as much as Leah's eyes, because we've already seen a couple of recollections of Genesis 18 and 19, both with the urging that we just saw, that recalled Lot urging the angelic visitors to stay with him rather than the square, and also Abraham running that we saw like Esau was running. So a number of connections there, as well as the angels, obviously. But this is nonsense. And we don't know exactly how old the children are. We know that they were born often, if not simultaneously, certainly faster than one woman could give birth to them, given the 4 women. But no years are suggested there, other than the fact that it's been 20 years that Jacob was with Laban. And he obviously didn't have any children with Rachel in those first 7 years. So we know they may be young, but are they frail? Certainly they've gotten this far. He wasn't hesitant to move them from Laban's country all the way to where they are here. And if we look at the map just a little bit, we can see Sukkoth, at least the best understanding of where it can be is here, and Shechem there. And plainly, the old country was back here, way up here where he was, but he's just otherwise been at Penuel here, we know, and he was at Mahanaim here. So we don't know for sure where those places are, but assuming he's been in this region, he certainly had no hesitation to travel. And the children have gotten there, and there's been no sense there's anything wrong with them. And then this extra line is also nonsense. The flocks and the herds which are nursing here, a lot here, only here in Genesis. It's in 1 Samuel, that's a mistake here, 6:10. I'm not sure where the 6 got left out there, where just such cows, described as milk cows, pull the ark around. So there's no problem there with milk cows. which is say cows that are giving milk, nursing, not at carnation giving milk for us, but giving milk to their calves, means that they can't move around. The phrase "our care for me" is simply not in the Hebrew. It's just simply Hebrew. The flocks and herds are nursing, and if they are overdriven, it continues there. And the word for overdriven here, unpronounceable without the vowels you can see there, is only in Judges and Song of Songs, both as knocking on a door. And it can be knocking or it can mean pushing. But it begs the question, why would they need to be overdriven? Esau didn't say any particular speed. He says doesn't seem to be any hurry. We don't even know where Esau was going. He was out there, and Jacob's messenger said once they got to him that he was coming to you. But would he have been coming to Jacob if the messengers hadn't told him where Jacob and his family were? How would he have otherwise known? As far as we know, Esau was just going about his own business and has no apparent hurry, having just reunited with his brother. So the sense that you have to be overdriven, they have to be worked too hard to prevent traveling alongside is just simply nonsense. The idea that all the flocks will die. I mean, Jacob's been taking care of animals like this for over 20 years, and we have no sense that he's let them die. And so Esau must know this is as much nonsense as the excuses that the guests make in the Lucan story about people invited to the wedding feast who talk about, I bought some land and I have to inspect it, or I bought some oxen and I have to look at them, or other silly things like that are meant to be an insult. Is Jacob meaning to insult his brother? He's certainly signaling that I just don't want to go with you without saying it so directly. But we don't hear what Esau thinks. So having given these two lame excuses, the children are fail and the flocks are nursing, he offers this. Let my Lord, again for the second time here, pass on ahead of his servant, literally a please there, as we can see in the key words section down here. Please pass on, using what we've seen the Hebrew word avar many times in these chapters. Pass on ahead of his servant, literally toward the faces, we can see. And notice the faces are plural, but the servant is singular, which suggests toward the faces of his family. And I will lead on slowly. The word for lead here at Nahal is only one other time in Genesis, but it's almost always for God leading, for God's guidance. Most famously in Psalm 23, that you can probably recite yourself. There's only one other reference that's not to God leading. It's where the people fail to have a leader, a guide. So guiding in the sense of God's guiding, and we've already seen Jacob once deny, am I in the place of God, when Rachel demanded children or she would die. Is that what's implicit here? It's not clear. It simply seems to be about leading the animals and his family, but there is the connection there. And he will lead them on slowly or gently, which is one of a couple interesting connections to the Absalom story here. This is where David says, go gently with the young man Absalom. And that's not just random necessarily, because we know in the next chapter, spoiler alert if you're not aware of it, one of Jacob's daughters is going to be raped. And in the 2 Samuel story, Absalom's sister Tamar is raped. And in both situations, Jacob and David hesitate and aren't sure what to do. So there are a couple of ways, as we'll see, that the Absalom story is just in the background and may come more into the foreground when we get to chapter 34 about how do Israelites respond to rape. So I will lead on slowly according to the pace of the cattle, literally to their feet's occupation. I just put it here, to the feet of the cattle. And notice the feet and faces and hand. We didn't have hand right here, but we heard it earlier. Continuing the body parts theme of intimacy. So according to the feet of the cattle, is it the issue of the cattle going slowly? Presumably he can lead them at whatever pace he wants to. So is this the pace they would go on their own? Presumably on their own they wouldn't be going anywhere except to where there's food. So that's confusing as well. The word melakah here usually meaning the work. We only see it otherwise in the garden story, right back in the beginning, and once in the Joseph story, not as directly relevant here, to this particular word for cattle, that are before me, again, before my face. So notice he's suggesting the cattle, which the ones that he's giving as the present, the 550. It doesn't seem to have other cattle there. He must have more. You'd think he sent around 550 as a present, but everything he has is with him. And we are told that he sent ahead everything he had. So is he really giving away all of his cattle? We'll see just a few verses down. As you can see, he made booths for his cattle, so he doesn't seem to have given them all away. So there's an ambiguity there about that, that he still has the cattle and the herds that are nursing here. They weren't accounted for earlier. And so, and both the pace of the cattle and according to the feet of the children here. And again, that's questionable. Little children wouldn't just be walking at their small children's pace. They would either put them on a donkey, which there are, or they would carry them, and they have servants, and so servants could carry some as well. There's 4 mothers here, and that means you could easily carry a number of the little ones, and they shouldn't really be that little at this point. So all of this is suspicious. And yet he promises, until I come to my Lord and seer. And as Westerman notes, a polite way of saying in the circumstances that he would not want to contradict his brother. Esau knows quite well that it is not meant to be taken seriously. But as Levinson notes, Jacob never comes to his brother in Seir, but instead journeys to Succoth. He once again succeeds in securing his independence from the larger family, thus maintaining the distinctive identity of his lineage against the threat of assimilation into the surrounding nations. But is that so? We've heard nothing in this passage that he's afraid of being assimilated into Esau's lineage. That was the concern of his parents, of their parents, when Esau married the local Canaanites. But we've not heard that concern in Jacob. What the concern of Jacob is that Esau will kill him and his whole family. And not about ethnicity, but simply about brotherhood. So I'm not sure there's evidence for Levinson's conclusion there, but you can draw your own conclusion. In Seir links back with 32:3 when he sent the messengers to Seir, and as we saw here on the atlas, too far down, that's down in this area where Edom is down here. And so, given that, Esau doesn't argue with him, doesn't say, those are lame excuses, brother, or why are you lying to me, or why won't you let me go with you? That kind of direct speech, of course, is rare, and we wouldn't see it often. If to the extent this is compared with any kind of relationship with Genesis 23, with Abraham negotiating with the Hittites for the land, we saw there all the indirect speech that can often confound modern readers whose way of communicating is so different from these people in their cultural context. So Esau doesn't directly challenge that, but he offers an alternative. Let me leave with you some of those who were with me. And let's look at that in some detail. He adds a please here. So in response to Jacob's plea, multiple pleases, now he gets polite. Let me leave with you here. As Westerman suggests, a generous offer of an escort, or I'm suggesting perhaps a delegation of spies, and perhaps that's what Jacob thinks, is you're leaving some to spy on me. And in the context of 2 nations, perhaps it can be the question of Edomites among the Israelites. But as we saw in Deuteronomy 23:8, even that text, which in chapter 7 in Deuteronomy calls for the massacre and destruction of all the major 7 named peoples of the land of Canaan, makes an exception for Edom and says in the 3rd generation they can be welcomed into the Israelite community. So there doesn't seem to be any otherwise biblical objection to Edomites among the Israelites, and that seems to be what Esau is offering here. But Jacob rejects it again. Notice that some of the people here, using Emekah here, not just the men, Anashim it would be if he's saying just the 500 men. And yet again, we know nothing about the family. We know nothing about who those 500 are. Jacob assumed they were an army, but we hear nothing about them being armed. And we don't know anything about them. It said they were men specifically, so we can't assume this includes wives and children. And yet he's addressing them as family, like they're his people, not just his servants or not just his men, as David's group is often addressed as his men. And so he offers that, but Jacob offers again an indirect no. Why should my Lord be so kind to me? And that Esau could have continued. He could have said, well, here's why. In the last 20 years, this is what's been happening with me. And of course, I can't fill it in because the text does, and we don't know. But whatever it is that seems to lead Esau to be so magnanimous, to accept the blessing back, to run and hug and kiss his brother, and as far as we've seen, no violence and no threats of violence, and nothing but direct speech from Esau, the fact that Jacob is still so suspicious puts it on Israel and Jacob, not on Esau. And so it's completely switched around here. We see that when Esau, representing Edom, offers to live in parallel and work together, it's Israel who says no. And we'll have to see what effect that has when we see the wrong choice that Jacob makes right after this, refusing to stay with his brother, but then settling just opposite Shechem, and all hell breaks loose, as we'll see. So in his immediate question here, as my note has below, basically what I just said. Why should my Lord be so kind to me? Or literally, why should I obtain favor in your eyes, as we see over here? As my note has below, Jacob asked rhetorically why Esau should grant him the forgiveness he was seeking, which remains a mystery in the story. Esau, like God, offers another chance without giving a reason for it other than the apparent power of kinship. It also suggests the question of why the Canaanites, if we want to see this as part of the bigger picture, having once been cheated of the birthright to the land of Israel, which is to say they were the older people who were in the land first, and the younger Israel came along and took the land and claimed divine authority for it. What this means after exile. Should they peacefully allow the post-exilic community, which was not so good to them, to return? And so that may well be a question for the exilic audience of Genesis. And so we see with literally no ceremony, no food, no nothing. It doesn't say they hugged again or they exchanged any kind of food or anything, just as Jacob did with his wily uncle Laban, where they had a stone and poured fluids on it, had a whole ritual and border covenant, promised to treat each other fairly if they ever encountered each other again. Simply we hear Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. With no further ado, not even a goodbye. And we're going to go one more verse just to set up what's coming because it's very tricky. Jacob journeyed to Succoth, which is 3 times in this verse because the word for booth is Succoth as well. So he journeyed to Succoth, which is I noted in the picture here. And the atlas is apparently right there, not too far from Penuel, and built himself a house. And if we look at building in Genesis, we see that anytime there's building other than an altar to Yahweh, it's not a good thing, other than God, of course. So Cain built a city, Nimrod built Nineveh, the collected humans built the Tower of Babel, and now Jacob builds a house. Look who that puts him with. And it's not that building houses is bad, but the issue, as we'll see next video, he's settled too soon. He'd made the vow that if God brought him back to his father's house, which was in Beersheba, and as you can see from the map, he's not anywhere near Beersheba here, which is all the way down here. So one of the issues of house, as Hidary suggests, that Jacob built a house for God based on the meaning of lo here, lo by it, could suggest that it's a house for God, although it doesn't say that, in response to his earlier prayer as a quest for atonement that we saw in the Four Faces verse, translated in Norris V as appease, but she suggests it's related to atonement, hence Jacob's personal Yom Kippur, the collective day of atonement that's, of course, strong in the Jewish tradition to this day. And so having experienced some kind of atonement in Esau accepting back the blessing, he builds a house for God as a thank you, as an offering. And yet it doesn't say that. And it also connects it to the booths for his cattle, suggesting maybe he made a house for God and booths for his cattle. But the booths for his cattle is suggesting that he's settling. It isn't just making an altar that he moves on from, like Abraham and various in his either name did, but that he's settling. And moved booths for the cattle and called the place Succoth, called it booths. And so Esau's gone back to be the migratory person in Seir, and Jacob's now settled. But we'll see in the next verse that he suddenly ends up in the city of Shechem. So we'll have to see the relation between Succoth and Shechem and the historical nature of Shechem, what that means for what happens to Jacob's daughter Dinah in that story. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.